Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. It's been 1 month since Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine. I'm currently standing in Warsaw's central train station. I just met this guy Bruno, who himself is a refugee from Kyiv, where he had only a year left on his economic degree before the war interrupted everything. Now he's volunteering here, where he's helping with more refugees coming from Ukraine. The Polish people have been amazingly generous. They've opened up their wallets and homes to all of these refugees fleeing the war. Warsaw alone has seen a 17% increase in its population. And that was the statistic from last week. That number continues to rise right now. Just looking at images coming from the besieged city of Mariupol, which has been leveled to the ground by Russian forces, tells us why that is. More than 10 million Ukrainians have been displaced from their homes. That's almost a quarter of the entire population. I've listed down in the description below several charities that you guys can donate to help them out. While I'm here in Warsaw, I'll also try to investigate a few other charities that could really use your support. Thank you for your patience. On to the rest of the video. Here on this channel, we often talk a lot about the failures of the Jedi Order and what makes them into such a dangerous organization. My purpose for this has always been to inspire audiences to be more critical and independent thinkers, to not just take things at face value. And that is because a society of independent and critical thinkers is the key to any democratic and free system. Nothing should be above examination or critique, including a so-called heroic organization known as the Jedi Order. Today, we're going to take a look at how the Jedi's behavior and actions potentially led to the creation of the Sith. We'll also discuss whether the Jedi are the sole reason why the Sith were created in the first place. During this discussion, we will reference real-life events, including current events going on right now, and that's because science fiction, and Star Wars specifically, has always been an exercise in self-examination of our society, disguised as a space opera. Most of us probably won't watch C-SPAN all day long, but if you add X-Wings and lightsabers, maybe more people will care. From an evolutionary standpoint, humans find comfort in the group, in groupthink, and also in tribalism. Independent thinking, however, can guard us against the more negative aspects of those mindsets. But one does not become a critical or independent thinker overnight. One has to develop a curiosity for finding the truth and not fall into the lazy trap of letting other people think for you. An independent thinker also needs to be objective. They need to be able to question everything, including their own biases, in order to pursue the truth. These type of thinkers, therefore, are more resilient against authoritarianism, totalitarianism, and other strongman types who try to seize absolute power. That's because they naturally are curious, want to ask questions, and figure out the truth for themselves. They aren't ready to allow others to dominate their minds and think for them and tell them what to do. That is what usually makes them targets for oppression by authoritarians. Because the truth can be very dangerous, but not all suppressions of the truth are the same. You see, the Jedi Order was a very top-down hierarchy. At the top, you had a ruling council, which basically advised the Grand Master and helped decide which direction the Jedi Order would go in. The Jedi Council will vote on things like the expulsion of one of their members, but for the most part, a small group of individuals dictate the future for this larger body. And unfortunately, the Jedi place strict limits on their followers, which is somewhat troubling and reminiscent of certain types of more fundamentalist religions found here on Earth. But there are some key differences about the Jedi Order that makes them quite unique and very different from other authoritarian organizations. For the most part, the Jedi were actually pretty open-minded about most things, and one of their central tenets was the rejection of trying to control other people and gain power. Of course, you did have some of their more strict beliefs as well. For instance, the Jedi could not develop emotional attachments because that could compromise them. The Jedi had great force powers, and with that came great responsibility. The fear is that a powerful Jedi could fall to the dark side because of their emotions. This was a real and present danger. Just look at how much damage Count Dooku was able to do once he left the Jedi Order. And so the dark side is really the only place where the Jedi really limit freedom of speech and also critical thinking. They have very clear guidelines about it. During the Jedi High Republic period, Jedi younglings were scolded for having too much interest in the dark side, and all materials and readings associated with the Sith were hidden or locked away in the archives. The Jedi have made a calculated decision to not trust their members. They don't trust them to learn for themselves why the dark side is potentially dangerous, and instead they impose these kind of rules. Of course, the better take here would be to educate the Jedi about the Sith and provide close mentorship so that they don't fall to the dark side. Such course of action takes a lot of trust and also a lot of courage, but ultimately it would build a much stronger Jedi Order. If you take a look at the Jedi during the opening days of the Clone Wars, they were completely unprepared for the Sith because they knew nothing about how they fought or acted. Ever since Putin invaded Ukraine, many Western companies have tried to remove Russian state-sponsored media, like Russia Today, from platforms like Facebook and YouTube. The fear in the United States is that many individuals will mistake that RT logo for something like Reuters, when in fact, this is just Russian propaganda created by the states. This is a really tricky situation. As an avid follower of geopolitics, I oftentimes read Russia Today. I also read the Chinese state-sponsored People's Daily and Global Times. I find it very important to find out what these regimes are telling their own people, because as they become more repressive, it's going to get harder and harder to understand what's actually going on in places like China and Russia. At the same time, I do see people, including my fellow Americans, parroting the talking points of some horrendously repressive regimes, which of course is not ideal. I mean, even in the Jedi Order, you have examples of why the Jedi are right to censor stuff about the Sith. Master Lina Castana was one of the rare Jedi who believed that Jedi younglings needed to be introduced to the Sith in a controlled setting so that they can properly learn how to resist the dark side, so that if they ever encountered it alone, they would be prepared. Now, Master Lina Castana would teach Count Dooku for a period of time, and well, we can see where he ultimately ended up. Of course, this isn't completely Master Lina Castana's fault. There are other factors involved. But the point here is that dark side information did its damage. Now, social media has created a really interesting phenomenon. You have large swaths of people who are never interested in politics, who never read the papers or followed the news online or looked at archives, whatever. And now, because of social media, everyone has access to political news, a lot of times dumbed down political memes. And although we have all the information in the world now, it can sometimes be very confusing to give context to those things if we don't understand the background of these stories. And so now we're seeing a lot of false equivalencies being made and whataboutism making their rounds. These two concepts are key Soviet propaganda tools that were devised to draw comparisons between the Soviet Union's own oppression and the much less severe action of Western democracies. For instance, China will sometimes defend its mass persecution of Tibetans and Uyghurs and the placement of Uyghurs in internment and re-education camps as a similar thing to America's own race issues, which we of course know are completely different issues. Another common thing that's being thrown out there right now is America's censorship of Russia Today being compared to Russia's censorship of Western media. All it takes is just a little bit of research and you can quickly see the bullshit in these kind of comparisons. In the US, Russia Today is not banned. You can look it up on a browser. There is no official government ban. This is simply private companies like Facebook and YouTube that have decided to do this, most likely as a reaction to their consumers' demand. One does not get arrested for simply looking at Russia Today. One does not get arrested for spouting Russian propaganda in public. It's allowed and it's almost celebrated. But in Russia, the simple act of calling this war in Ukraine what it is, a war, and not some small-scale military operation, can lead to fines and even imprisonment of up to 15 years.
Вас уже задерживают. Мнение показал.
Вот я тоже хочу высказать тогда свое мнение.
Скажите.
Меня устраивает то, что...
Это шок-контент. Человек пришел сказать, что ее...
And it's not privately owned companies levying these fines and censoring things, it's the central government. Furthermore, in societies like China, North Korea, Russia, the Galactic Empire, where the central government maintains strict policies over what people can say or do, there's actually a collective fear over being curious and asking questions. People are conditioned to avoid overthinking because of the dangers that come with it, whether it be fines or even prison time or even condemnation by your community. And even when confronted with the obvious lies that their regimes tells them, many of these individuals are indoctrinated to lash out and defend their very oppressors. I've seen this soul-crushing thing happen with my own eyes. It is heartbreaking and terrifying. Even the Jedi Order, which had very strict policies against the Sith, will not imprison young Jedi for being curious about the Sith. Instead, more one-on-one mentoring was usually given. And that's because the Jedi are redeemable somewhat, because a central tenet that they have is their rejection of power and control over others, as we mentioned before. And so the Jedi, like most Western democracies, are imperfect, and their hands are relatively unclean, but at least they're willing to show their hands to the world and allow individuals to come up with their own opinions about what's going on. It's individuals who hide their hands and try to cover up everything. Those are the people we have to worry about. This is a very important difference between authoritarians like Putin and Xi Jinping and Western democracies. It's also probably why even the Kremlin's largest oligarchs have a lot of their assets parked in the West. Well, at least they used to. So how are the Sith actually created? Well, there is the more complicated Legends version of the story, which is slightly unofficial, and then the canon version, which is very vague. But the general consensus is this: a group of Jedi began practicing the dark arts, and they were eventually kicked out by the Jedi Order when they were found out. They weren't murdered, they weren't killed, well, at least initially. They were just allowed to leave. The dark side exiles would continue studying the Force and eventually started their own society. And ever since, the Jedi and Sith have clashed in massive conflicts that have probably caused more damage than any other organization in Star Wars history. And so are the Jedi responsible for the creation of the Sith? Well, the simple answer is you can definitely make that argument. Especially if you consider the Legends version of the story where the first dark side exiles were more or less peaceful and just wanted to study the dark side and were forced into confrontation by the Jedi. And in Legends, it should be noted that the Jedi were not balanced individuals. They were seen as light side extremists, and so the dark side exiles were their opposite. The ancient Jedi that both organizations came from believed that balance needed to be found within oneself before you could bring order to the galaxy. And so these ancient Jedi practiced both the dark and light side. This, in my opinion, was the optimal situation that would have led to much more peace and stability all throughout the galaxy. But instead, the Jedi chose warfare and destruction. Any dark side exile who was on the fence about things before were now 100% against the Jedi, especially after the sacking of Korriban and the genocide of the Sith carried out by the Jedi-allied Republic thousands of years later. The saddest thing about this is that the Jedi and the Jedi exiles were brothers in arms at one point in time. But the Jedi failed to see the humanity in their brothers once they turned to the dark side. When we stop humanizing other people, it becomes easier to hurt them, to rip them apart, and to kill them. I see this a lot in the culture wars that are being fought right now here in the States. When I read articles titled, "Yes, my dear, all white people are racist," it fills my heart with sorrow and dread. For lefties who are confused why so many people who before were not political came out to vote for Trump in 2016, this is the reason. It's not because Americans are racist. It's because you dehumanized them by not giving them a chance. You generalized them, gave them no chance to defend themselves, and so the Orange Man became their voice. Now, this author is an African-American woman, and I imagine her grievances are somewhat justified. She's probably faced a lot of racism in her life. But when she chose blood, she just perpetuated this cycle of hatred and violence. And many others in the media on both sides decided to fall into this trap, while the rest of us ordinary sane Americans watched in horror as our society basically ripped itself apart and our democracy was almost lost. As a Chinese American who has dealt with racism all my life, I've always wanted to end racism. But from a very early age, I realized that you have to be empathetic to people, even individuals who are racist. And oftentimes you have to give these people the benefit of the doubt. That's because racism, just like Sith ideology, wasn't always rooted in evil. Oftentimes it's rooted in ignorance, misunderstanding. Racist people and Sith lords are oftentimes victims to their own ideology. Racism is sometimes also rooted in frustration and anger about completely unrelated things. More importantly, everyone is racist. Black people, white people, Hispanic people, and definitely Asians as well. And so it's important to humanize each other, even if they are the perceived enemy. Because ultimately the fight against racism is very important. But if you don't see racists as human beings anymore, you'll repeat the same mistakes that the Jedi did with the dark side exiles. If you're empathetic to a racist, it might actually shock them. It'll make them drop their guard and allow you to actually have a meaningful conversation so you can discuss those beliefs and potentially even change their mind. If you start off by just attacking them and calling them evil, you will alienate them, force them to retreat into their own tight circles, and that will only reinforce their beliefs. This is the reason why the Jedi and Sith have almost destroyed the galaxy many times over. because of this perpetuation of hatred and misunderstanding. The same lesson needs to be applied to the current invasion of Ukraine. As much as I want to scream Ruski Vayani Karabi even nahui on CSGO, the reality is if we want peace in Ukraine, the Russian people, our fellow human beings, are going to play an integral part in this endeavor. They suffer under Putin too, and they are misguided by his control over the media. They also suffer heavily from our Western sanctions. Also, many Russians right now are protesting against Putin and greatly endangering their lives for freedom and democracy and for Ukraine. So it's important to share these stories, share these images. Maybe it'll get through the great firewall that is coming down around Russia as well. What we have to avoid at all costs is hate crimes and other unnecessary attacks against regular Russian people. This will only fuel Putin's rhetoric and unjust war. And lastly, guys, if you want to help out the people of Ukraine, I've listed in the description below several different charities that you guys can take a look at. They aid either the civilians or refugees fleeing the country, and one of these charities, Army SOS, actually provides non-lethal aid directly to the Ukrainian defenders. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy,